Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Ivy threatened to kill Dylan after seeing her actions toward Will, and from the moment those words left Ivy's mouth, the entire atmosphere of the BNB shop shifted into something dark, electric, and terrifying, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the danger now pulsing through the room, because this was no idle threat tossed out in a moment of jealousy or frustration. This was something deeper, something born from weeks of simmering resentment, unspoken rage, and a fierce, almost obsessive protectiveness over Will that had been growing inside Ivy like a storm waiting to break. And when she finally saw Dylan standing too close to him, touching his arm just a second too long, speaking in that low, intimate tone that Ivy immediately recognized as calculated rather than innocent, something in her snapped, sending her spiraling into a confrontation that no one in the shop was prepared for. Not the customers quietly browsing, not the staff frozen behind the counter, and certainly not Will, who suddenly found himself at the center of chaos he never asked for, watching two people he cared about turn into strangers before his eyes. Ivy's threat shocks everyone because it wasn't shouted hysterically or delivered with wild gestures, but spoken calmly, coldly, with a steadiness that made it far more chilling. Her eyes locked on Dylan's with an intensity that suggested she had already crossed a line internally, that she had imagined the outcome and decided she was capable of following through, and Dylan, usually so composed and confident, visibly faltered, her smile slipping as she realized this wasn't just another dramatic outburst she could brush off, because Ivy knew things, had seen things, had interpreted Dylan's actions toward Will not as harmless flirtation but as manipulation, as a deliberate attempt to undermine what Ivy believed she and Will had built together. And that belief fueled her words with a frightening sincerity, the question on everyone's mind. Dylan in danger, hung heavy in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore, because Ivy wasn't known for making threats lightly, and the raw emotion behind her eyes suggested that she felt backed into a corner, as if Dylan's presence in Will's life was an invasion she could no longer tolerate, and Will, caught between shock and disbelief, tried to intervene, stepping forward, calling Ivy's name, reminding her where they were, reminding her that this wasn't who she was, but his voice seemed to reach her only faintly, as though she were already drifting away from reason, anchored instead to the narrative she had constructed in her mind where Dylan was the villain and she was the only one strong enough to stop her. Ivy threatens Dylan's life, and in that moment, the B&B shop becomes more than just a boutique. It becomes the stage for a psychological showdown, one where long-held grudges, insecurities, and desires collide in full view of everyone, stripping away polite facades and exposing the raw motivations underneath. Because Ivy's anger wasn't just about Will, it was about control, about fear of losing her place, about the humiliation she imagined if Dylan succeeded in pulling Will into her orbit, and Dylan, for her part, struggled to maintain her composure, insisting she had done nothing wrong, that Will was his own person, free to make his own choices. Words that only inflamed Ivy further because they sounded like justification rather than denial, like a declaration that she had every right to pursue him regardless of the consequences, and that implication cut deep, driving Ivy to lean closer, her voice dropping as she delivered the threat again, slower this time, ensuring Dylan understood it wasn't metaphorical, wasn't exaggerated, but a promise of what would happen if she didn't back off. The shock rippled outward, whispers spreading among the onlookers, some horrified, some morbidly fascinated, all aware that they were witnessing something that could not be undone. Because once a threat like that is spoken aloud, it changes everything, reshaping relationships and planting seeds of fear that linger long after the moment passes. And Will felt that weight crushing down on him, guilt twisting in his chest because somehow, through no deliberate action of his own, he had become the catalyst for this eruption, the object over which two people were now willing to destroy each other. And he hated it, hated the way Ivy looked at him as if expecting validation, hated the way Dylan looked at him as if silently asking him to choose a side, when all he wanted was for the shouting to stop and for everyone to remember that they were human beings, not pieces on a board. Will at the center of chaos is not a position he sought, but as the tension escalated, it became clear that his response, or lack thereof, would shape what happened next. Because Ivy's fixation on protecting what she believed was hers had narrowed her world until Dylan represented the ultimate threat, and Dylan, sensing the real danger now, tried to retreat, to de-escalate, but Ivy interpreted that as cowardice rather than wisdom, reinforcing her belief that Dylan was guilty of something, that she had been exposed and was now scrambling, and that belief hardened Ivy's resolve even further. The B&B shop buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that makes people hold their breath, waiting for a breaking point, and when Will finally raised his voice, demanding that Ivy stop, telling her that threatening Dylan was unacceptable, that it scared him, that it wasn't love but control. Something in Ivy cracked, her expression flickering between fury and devastation as she realized that instead of pulling Will closer, her actions were pushing him away, and that realization made her threat even more tragic and dangerous, because it came from a place of desperation rather than strength. And desperate people are unpredictable, Dylan, shaken but defiant, warned Ivy that she wouldn't be intimidated, that threats had consequences, legal ones, moral ones, words that only underscored how far things had gone, turning a personal conflict into something that could spiral into police reports, restraining orders, and irreversible damage. And suddenly the dramatic question, Dylan in danger, felt less like sensational speculation and more like a genuine concern, because Ivy's emotional state was clearly unstable, her sense of right and wrong blurred by fear and jealousy, and as staff members finally stepped in, urging everyone to calm down, threatening to call security, the moment fractured, the intensity dissipating just enough for reality to seep back in, leaving behind the wreckage of what had been said. Ivy's threat shocks everyone not only because of its severity, but because it revealed a side of her no one wanted to acknowledge, a capacity for darkness that had been hiding beneath her polished exterior. And as Dylan left the shop under watchful eyes, her shoulders tense, her confidence shaken, the danger didn't disappear with her, it lingered, hovering over Ivy and Will like a shadow, because words like those don't vanish, they echo, and Will knew that whatever came next, things could never go back to the way they were, that trust had been fractured, lines crossed, and the simple act of standing between two people had turned him into the axis around which everything now revolved. Ivy remained behind, trembling, the adrenaline fading and leaving exhaustion in its wake, forced to confront the reality of what she had almost unleashed, while whispers continued to ripple through the B&B shop, carrying the story outward, transforming it into rumor, into speculation, into a narrative that would follow them all, because in a world where emotions run high and loyalties shift quickly, a single threat can redefine everything, and Ivy threatening Dylan's life over Will wasn't just a shocking moment, it was the spark that ignited a chain reaction of consequences, fear, and reckoning, leaving everyone to wonder not only whether Dylan was truly safe, but whether Ivy herself could be pulled back from the edge she had revealed. In the aftermath of Dylan's exit from the B&B shop, the silence that followed was somehow louder than the confrontation itself, stretching thick and uncomfortable as everyone processed the gravity of what had just occurred, because Ivy's threat did not dissipate with Dylan's departure but instead settled into the space like a poisonous fog, clinging to every surface, every whispered thought, every stolen glance, and Will could feel it pressing against his chest as he stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at Ivy with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and heartbreak, realizing in that moment that the woman he thought he knew had revealed something raw and volatile that could no longer be ignored. Ivy, for her part, seemed almost dazed now, her earlier fury draining away to leave behind trembling hands and shallow breaths, as if the realization of what she had said was only just beginning to sink in, and yet even in her shock there was a flicker of defiance, a refusal to fully retract the sentiment behind her words, because in her mind Dylan was still the threat, still the catalyst, still the outsider who had dared to disrupt the fragile sense of security Ivy had wrapped around her connection to Will, and that conviction, however warped, continued to burn beneath the surface. Will broke the silence first, his voice low but strained, asking Ivy what she thought she was doing, asking her how she could say something like that, how she could even imagine hurting someone, and his words were not accusatory so much as pleading, because he needed, to believe there was an explanation that didn't involve the terrifying implications now swirling around them. But Ivy's response only deepened the unease, as she insisted that Dylan had pushed her too far, that she had seen the way Dylan looked at him, the way she positioned herself, the way she subtly undermined Ivy at every opportunity, and that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge it, forcing Ivy to be the only one brave enough to draw a line. Those listening shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging skeptical looks, others clearly disturbed, because even if Dylan's behavior had been questionable, Nothing justified a death threat, and the collective judgment in the room was unmistakable. Isolating Ivy further and fueling the sense that she was being misunderstood, cornered, and unfairly condemned, as security finally arrived, their presence adding a clinical formality to the emotional wreckage, Ivy was asked to step aside, to calm down, to explain herself, and while she complied, her eyes never left Will, searching his face for reassurance, for loyalty, for any sign that he was still on her side, but what she found instead was distance, his posture closed, his expression guarded, and that subtle shift hurt her more deeply than any reprimand ever could, because it confirmed her greatest fear, that in trying to protect what she thought was hers, she had endangered it beyond repair. Meanwhile, Dylan, though physically removed from the scene, was far from safe in spirit, her hands shaking as she walked away, replaying Ivy's words over and over in her mind, each repetition sharpening the edge of fear she hated to admit she felt, because threats like that linger. Because Ivy's eyes had not been empty or performative, but burning with something unhinged, and Dylan knew enough about people to recognize when someone was capable of crossing a line they couldn't return from, prompting her to question every step she took, every shadow behind her, every sound that seemed too close for comfort. The question of whether Dylan was truly in danger now expanded beyond the confines of the B&B shop, seeping into private conversations, text messages, late-night phone calls, as news of the confrontation spread, embellished and amplified with each retelling, transforming Ivy's words into something almost mythic in their menace, and while some dismissed it as an emotional outburst blown out of proportion, others took it very seriously, urging Dylan to be cautious, to document everything, to consider her safety first, because even a single moment of unchecked rage can escalate when pride and obsession are involved. Will found himself pulled in opposing directions, bombarded with concern from friends who warned him that Ivy's behavior was a red flag he couldn't ignore, while Ivy herself oscillated between remorse and justification, sometimes apologizing through tears, insisting she hadn't meant it literally, other times doubling down, arguing that Dylan had provoked her and that anyone in her position would have reacted the same way, and that inconsistency only deepened Will's turmoil, because it made it impossible to know which version of Ivy was the truth, the loving partner he had trusted, or the volatile woman who believed threats were a reasonable response to perceived betrayal. As days passed, the tension refused to dissipate, instead tightening like a coiled spring, with every chance encounter, every unanswered message, every rumor threatening to trigger another explosion, and when Will finally met with Dylan to talk things through, hoping to defuse the situation, the conversation only highlighted how deeply fractured everything had become, because Dylan was no longer willing to downplay Ivy's actions, her usual composure edged with anger as she made it clear that she would not tolerate being intimidated or endangered, and that Will needed to understand the seriousness of what had happened, forcing him to confront the possibility that by staying neutral, by trying to appease everyone, he might actually be enabling the very chaos he wanted to avoid. Ivy's isolation grew as the social circle subtly but unmistakably shifted away from her. Invitations dwindling, conversations becoming strained, and that sense of abandonment fed into her narrative that she was being punished for loving too fiercely, for refusing to stand by while someone tried to steal what mattered to her, and instead of prompting self-reflection, it hardened her resentment, pushing her further into a mindset where she was the victim and everyone else was complicit in her suffering. Late at night, alone with her thoughts, Ivy replayed the moment over and over. Sometimes wincing at her own words, sometimes convincing herself she would say them again if given the chance, because fear of losing Will eclipsed everything else, distorting her judgment until the idea of Dylan's removal, emotional, social, even physical, felt like the only way to restore balance, and that internal battle made her unpredictable, capable of swinging from vulnerability to hostility without warning, a fact not lost on those who observed her closely. Will, increasingly overwhelmed, began to realize that the chaos surrounding him was not accidental but the product of unresolved tensions and unspoken expectations that had been allowed to fester, and as much as he wanted to believe he could fix it with reassurance and patience, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore, that Ivy's threat had crossed a boundary that fundamentally altered how safe he felt around her, and that knowledge filled him with guilt, because caring about someone should not come with fear attached. The B&B shop incident continued to cast a long shadow, its memory resurfacing in unexpected ways. During casual conversations, during quiet moments of reflection, during arguments that spiraled back to that single, devastating sentence, and each time it was mentioned, the weight of it grew heavier, not lighter, reinforcing the sense that this was not a temporary flare-up but a defining fracture. The looming question, Dylan in danger, remained unresolved, its answer dependent not only on Ivy's actions but on whether anyone was willing to intervene decisively before words became something more, and as boundaries were discussed, warnings issued, and relationships strained to their breaking point, it became clear that the real danger extended beyond any one individual, threatening to consume them all if left unchecked, because obsession rarely exists in isolation, and when fear, jealousy, and pride collide, the fallout is rarely contained. Ivy threatened Dylan's life in a moment of explosive emotion, but the true shock lay in what followed, the slow unraveling, the erosion of trust, the dawning realization that some lines, once crossed, cannot be erased, only reckoned with, and as Will stood at the center of the chaos, forced to choose not between two people but between denial and responsibility, the future remained uncertain, heavy with consequences yet to unfold, leaving everyone to wonder whether this was the end of the story, or merely the beginning of something far more dangerous. The days following that uneasy stalemate felt unreal, as if time itself had slowed to force everyone to sit with the consequences of what Ivy had unleashed, and the longer the silence stretched, the more dangerous it felt, because unresolved tension has a way of fermenting into something volatile, and Will could sense it in every interaction, every cautious glance, every conversation that abruptly ended when Ivy's name surfaced, as though the threat itself had taken on a life of its own, hovering just out of sight but never out of mind. Ivy, increasingly restless, moved through her days with a brittle determination, oscillating between moments of intense self-justification, where she convinced herself she had been pushed, cornered, disrespected, and sudden flashes of panic when she imagined the legal, social, and personal fallout crashing down on her all at once, and yet even in her fear there was a stubborn refusal to fully repent, because doing so would mean admitting that her feelings, her instincts, her sense of being wronged might have been misplaced, and that was a truth she was not yet ready to confront. Will tried to establish boundaries, urging Ivy to give space, to let things cool down, but every attempt felt inadequate, because Ivy interpreted distance as abandonment, and abandonment as proof that Dylan had already won, and that belief fueled her resentment, turning every unanswered message into an insult, every delayed reply into evidence of betrayal, deepening the emotional spiral that had already begun. Meanwhile, Dylan's life shifted into a state of hyper-awareness, her routine subtly but noticeably altered as she avoided familiar places, double-checked locks, and kept her phone within reach at all times, not because she wanted to live in fear, but because ignoring the threat felt reckless, especially when Ivy's emotional volatility was now common knowledge, and although Dylan maintained a composed exterior in public, privately, she wrestled with anger, humiliation, and a gnawing sense of vulnerability, resenting the fact that someone else's obsession had forced her into a defensive posture she never asked for. Whispers continued to circulate, evolving into fractured narratives that painted Ivy alternately as a villain, a victim, or a tragic figure undone by love. And that lack of consensus only intensified the chaos, because everyone seemed to have an opinion, yet no one had a solution, leaving Will trapped in the uncomfortable role of mediator, expected to soothe tensions while also taking responsibility for a situation he never intended to create. When Ivy finally confronted him again, her voice softer but her eyes sharper, she framed her pain as loyalty, insisting that she had only reacted because she cared, because she refused to be passive while someone else interfered. And though Will tried to empathize with her feelings, he could not ignore the underlying threat that lingered beneath her words, the implication that she still believed Dylan posed a danger to what she valued most, and that belief alone was enough to keep him on edge. The emotional toll began to show, manifesting in sleepless nights, strained conversations, and a growing sense of dread that something irreversible was approaching, because unresolved obsession rarely fades quietly, and the longer Ivy clung to her narrative of righteous anger, the more entrenched it became, shaping her actions and reactions in ways that felt increasingly unpredictable. Dylan, determined not to be reduced to a passive character in someone else's drama, began documenting everything: messages, encounters, overheard remarks, not out of paranoia, but out of self-preservation, recognizing that Ivy's threat had already crossed into territory where accountability mattered, and that Preparation was not an admission of fear but an assertion of control, even as it underscored how far the situation had spiraled from anything resembling normal conflict. Will watched this unfold with a growing sense of responsibility, realizing that neutrality was no longer an option, that by trying to keep the peace he had inadvertently allowed the tension to fester. And the weight of that realization pressed heavily on him, forcing him to acknowledge that his presence at the center of the chaos was not incidental, but pivotal, because his choices, his silence,